Today, as David indicated, I'll be talking a little bit about engaging your community in the age of COVID. What do you do when perhaps the building is closed and the building has on a mask, as you can see from the slide? And so we are still called to engage our community, and there are many ways that we can do that. Before I proceed, I just want to share my story in reference to my context growing up. I grew up in rural Alabama in a county seat church. And for those who know what that means, it was one of the few churches in the entire county. The county that I grew up in had a mixed level of engagement, our constituents, our congregants in it. And so the county commissioner was a member of our congregation. The sheriff was a member of our congregation. Several of the judges were members, as well as my teachers, my principals, and so forth. And so all of them were a part of this local county seat church. And because of the level of diversity in the congregation, I observed and witnessed as a child this particular church really engaging the community. Almost everybody was at the table. The mayor was a relative of mine. And so we had access to almost all the components of the community. And because of that, we were able to do great ministry. I just want to say with that experience and with that background, a lot of times when we talk about engaging the community, a lot of times we overlook the rural context. But I just want to give a shout out to those serving in a rural context. That was my context for my formation and my development. And at its best, that's when I saw a level of community engagement that I try to model today. And so again, we know we have various contexts, but I just wanted to give a shout out about the rural context that formed me and my spiritual development. And I am forever grateful. Strong, vibrant churches, like communities, are not accidental. It takes intention. It takes work. It takes dedication to have a strong, vibrant church, as well as to have a strong, vibrant community. Churches, just like individuals, thrive when they see their story as part of a larger story. It is a story of faith in practical action and a story that testifies to the relationships between people and place. When we read the Bible, when we look at our own faith story, it is about people and it's about place. And today, in whatever context we serve, we need to, first of all, understand and know our story. And know that our story is about relationships. Our religion, our faith is about relationships. And it's not just about belief, but it's about relationship. Lay and pastoral leadership that is adaptive and wise will discover new avenues to connect what they believe to what they do. All of us know we should be engaging our community. All of us know that we should be outside of the four walls and doing various types of ministry, various levels of engagement in the community. But sometimes there's a disconnect between what we believe and what we do. So today I'm going to share a little insight on what we can do to engage our community, even in this time of COVID. The first thing I want to discuss with us is there is a difference between outreach and engagement. A lot of times we use the terms synonymously, that we think they mean the same thing, but there is a difference. When we think about community outreach, it's short term. As Karen mentioned this morning, sometimes it's a one and done. We collected 200 coats and we gave them out this winter to keep the children in the neighborhood or whoever needs them warm in the cold winter that we are experiencing. So it's short term. Community engagement is long term. It's not a one and done. It's something that will take a long time to do. It has a purpose. It has goals for long time development, not just to give out X amount of meals or X amount of coats, but it is more long term when you think about community engagement. Mary Kay, here we go again. Community outreach is marketing. And as Jack explained this morning, we do need to market the message. The disciples, the early church, they marketed this faith and it turned the world upside down. And so we need not to be afraid of marketing, but when you market, Your outreach activities, again, that's more of community outreach. Community engagement is about relationship building. I've been to many churches and many soup kitchens and many community outreach efforts where some people don't even look the people they're serving in the eyes. They don't acknowledge them as a person. Here's your meal, here's your coat, get it and keep moving. It's not about relationship. You don't know their name. You don't know who they are. You don't know their story. You're just passing out something on an assembly line and you want the line to keep moving. However, with community engagement, it's about relationships. You're building relationships with people in the community as well as in your congregation. Community outreach is what can our church do for you? What can A do for you? But when we think about community engagement, what can A and B do together? What can we and the community do together? I'm not doing something for you, but we are doing something together for the benefit of the entire community. Another difference is community outreach, one group benefits the most. Community engagement, the community benefits. So for some of those things that you're calling community outreach, who benefits? Is it just one group? Or is it the community? Whether they come to our church or not, whether they have faith in Jesus Christ or not, who benefits? Just you or just the people you're serving, or does the entire community benefit? Also with community outreach, it's transactional. It's a transaction. Again, I do something for you. I give you a coat, you get your coat and you leave. It's transactional. For community engagement, it's connectional, or I would rather use another T word, it's transformational. So is what you're calling outreach or engagement, is it transformational? Does it connect the community? Is it transforming the community? As opposed to just a transaction. And then the final difference between these two is community outreach is directional. Community engagement is cyclical. It's a cycle. It doesn't just end after we give out the coats, after we serve the meals, after we do whatever we're doing. It's a cycle and it continues because again, the goal is long-term, not short-term. As I've coached several congregations, many of them, again, think all the things they're doing as outreach is community engagement. We need both, but we need to be aware of the difference. Outreach is not engagement. Engagement is not outreach. We do need both in order to do all the things that we're called to do in community. So once again, outreach versus engagement. You can see the differences. I want you to take a look at this picture and tell me what you see. You can use the chat to indicate in the chat what you see. Give you about 30 seconds to respond. What do you see? Two half full glasses. That is a fact. Anyone else? What do you see? Both glasses equal. One glass with separate liquids, one glass mixed. All right. Thank you for answering this question. Now, my next question is, which one are you? Do you see the glass as half full? Or do you see the glass as half empty? Both of them are correct. They are both facts. But it's all about your perspective. And as we get into this work of community engagement, I want to propose to you, we need to have the perspective of half full instead of half empty. When you look at your congregation now, and many of us may not be back at capacity, do we use half empty language? Our church is half empty in worship today. Half of our ministries have people to serve in them. Or do you use the half full capacity? Our church is half full in worship today. Our ministries are half full with volunteers and people to serve in them. Your perspective will determine, in many cases, the outcome, especially in community development. Again, they're all true, they're facts, but it's all about your perspective. And I choose to be that optimist and believe that the glass is half full instead of half empty. Why is that important in community engagement? The reason that's important is because there is a dilemma. When we think about communities and we think about our congregations, what do we see? If we see the top part that's empty, individuals and communities have deficiencies and needs. So it's a negative perspective, pessimistic perspective. But if you're like me and you see the glass or pitcher in this case as half full, individuals and communities have assets and capacities. In our work of community engagement, the latter mindset or perspective is better. To view our individuals, to view our communities as having assets and capacities. When you look at this picture, it has capacity and it's not at full capacity. There is room to grow, but it also has assets already. Are we using the assets that are in there instead of just focusing on what's missing? And a lot of times in the church, when we do outreach and we do mercy ministries, we always think about what is needed. And we fail to think about the assets that are already present. So again, which perspective, which path are you going to choose? Individuals and communities have deficiencies and needs, or individuals and communities have assets and capacities? The mindset that I'm talking about when it comes to community engagement is something called asset-based community development. And what that is, it's an approach that takes stock in the resources or the assets that are already present in the community and in the congregation and recognizes how God is already at work, and then seeks to cultivate those assets and form partnerships. Colleagues, God is already working in your community, whether it's suburban, urban, or rural. God is already at work. And the question is, what is God already doing in your community? If you're bold enough, if you know what God is doing in your community, put it in the chat. What you believe God is already doing in your community. I'll scan the chat and see if we have any bold people to put in the chat what God is already doing. If not, reflect on it. Your coaches will ask you about this a little later as well. And then the next question is, how can your congregation join what God is already doing? Sometimes we're so arrogant to think that things can only get started when we Christians or we, the church, show up. But God is already at work. And your job is to perceive what God is already doing. Enjoying God in the work that's already going on in your community. When I got appointed to my current context in Washington, D.C., in Ward 7, Jones Memorial United Methodist Church, I wanted to find out what God was already doing in the neighborhood. I heard a lot of negative things. We're forgotten over here in Ward 8. We don't have this. We need this. We need that. We need this. Heard a lot of that from the congregation, a lot of that from the community. And I said, wait a minute, pump the brakes. Tell me what you have. Tell me the assets that are present that we can work upon. And whether it was in the congregation or whether it was in the community, many of them stopped, and it was harder to answer that question than it was to answer the question, what we need. We're wired a lot to think in the negative, we need this, but what do you already have? And in my discussion at various community forums, my first few weeks appointed during the pandemic, we discovered that within a 1 mile radius of our church, there were 6 schools. Within a half a mile radius of our church, there were 5 churches. Within a half mile radius of our church, there was a community center, there was a football field, football stadium. We realized that within that half a mile radius, there was the Anacostia Watershed Society, AWS. Within that half mile radius, there was a nonprofit organization called United Planning Organization. And the list goes on and on. Just by changing their perspective and asking a different question, we were able to find out what assets were present. And once we found out what assets were present, we began to collaborate. We began to work together for the greater good of the community, whether they came to our church or not. And so we worked together to see what God was already doing, and we joined God in the work. I recommend that you, if you don't know, find out what God is doing in your community and join God in the great work that God is already doing. Here are questions about your community that I recommend every pastor or key lay leader in the church should know the answers to. The first question is your community growing? Is it stagnant or declining? Mission Insight is a great resource. Our conference has free access to Mission Insight. If you haven't used it or you don't know about it, you can talk to me later, and we can get you set up with your district administrator to get your credentials so you can use it. It gives you demographics, it gives you insight, it gives you perception about the people in your community. It also lets you know whether or not your community is growing, stagnant, or declining. Question number 2 that every one of us should know is, what is the ethnic makeup of your community? Not your congregation, but your community. And sometimes you may be shocked to find out that the ethnic makeup of your community is not the same as your congregation. Number 3, what percentage of your community does not look like your church? We know that communities are changing, have changed, but you should be able to know what percentage of your community does not look like your church. Question number 4 about your community that you should know is, what's the age demographic of your community? Our congregation was shocked to find out that the average age of our community is 24.5 years old, much, much younger than the congregation. Again, this information is very useful. The largest growing demographic in our community is youth or children in middle school. And so again, as they continue to matriculate through middle school to high school, we should have a strong middle school ministry, a strong youth group, or at least be doing things, engaging our middle school and high school students, because they're the largest population in our community. And if we don't, and we know this information, then we're not truly engaging our community. The assets of religious institutions. Many of us don't realize the assets that we are as a religious institution. Number 1, as a religious institution, we're a permanent stakeholder in the community. Number 2, we're one of the few, in some cases it's debated, trusted institutions in the community. Are you cultivating that trust in your community. In many cases, the church or the religious institution has been in that neighborhood, that community, the longest of any institution. And we need to understand that and use that as an asset to engage our community. The third asset of religious institutions is it's comprised of a cross-section of the community. As I mentioned in my rural church that I grew up in, we had the mayor, we had the county commissioner, the sheriff, teachers, doctors, lawyers, everybody, factory workers, all in one congregation. A good cross-section, good diverse group representing everyone in the community. Other questions you should ask about your community. How many people in your community attend church? Again, Mission Insight can be a great tool to help you understand the percentage of people that attend church in your community. Number 7, how many languages are spoken in homes in your community? We started last year a ministry, English as a second language, because we realized there were a lot of migrants in our community. And the children were learning English, but the parents only spoke in their original language and they wanted to learn English. How many languages are spoken in homes in your community? Number 8, what is the average household income in your community? How does that compare to the average income of your congregation? Are many people in your community above or below the poverty line? What is the name of the primary political leader in your community? Again, in my context growing up, the mayor was a member of our community. So not only did we know who the mayor was, the name, he was a relative and also a member of our congregation. But depending on your context, do you know your county council person? Do you know your city council person? Do you know your elected officials? Do you know the mayor? Do you know the various political leaders in your community? If not, it's good to identify them and get to know who they are. And then finally, a question that you should know the answer to, and I should know the answer to, what's the 10-year plan of your community? Many communities, again, depending on your context, rural, suburban, or urban, they put out publicly a 10-year plan. What is in that 10-year plan? What's their plan for growth? What's their plan? And you can easily get a copy of that and you can see what the trends are, what is going to happen in the next 10 years in your community. So if you don't know the answer to this question, do some research and talk to some of those political leaders and you'll find out what the 10-year, some cities and some areas have a 20-year plan. And so again, depending on your community, find out the answer to this question. These questions will help you engage your community. It's hard to engage your community if you don't know who your community is. What are the steps of engaging your community? Step 1 is mapping assets. What are the assets first in your congregation? And then also, after you understand the assets in your congregation, what are the assets in the community? Again, the glass is half full. It has assets already. Map or determine, identify those assets. Step 2, build relationships. Who don't you know in your community? Who should you know in your community? It's not community outreach, it's community engagement. Build relationships with the people in your community. Once you've identified the assets, once you've built relationships, step 3, mobilize congregation and community assets. What can you do with your assets if you determine the intersection of your assets and the community's assets? And in that sweet spot of where they intersect, you do engagement in that particular area. You can transform your community if you understand and mobilize the congregation assets as well as the community assets where they intersect and in that sweet spot of engagement will be a great place to start. Step 4, convene community representatives. Start meeting with community representatives, community leaders, residents in your community, and bring them together to have collective power so that you can engage and so that you can make lasting change. Again, remember, this is about long term. It's not about the short term. And so you want to meet with as many people as you can, focus groups and forums and all of those town halls, all of those types of things. You want to bring people together so that you can have collective power. And then step number 5 is you want to leverage outside resources. Again, you have assets in your congregation. The community has assets, but how do you leverage those outside resources? And so if you follow these steps, it will help you leverage outside resources and engage your community. There are 6 community assets. The first asset is individuals, just like your church, individuals. Associations, what associations are in your community? Do you have homeowners association, neighborhood associations? Do you have Kiwanis? Do you have various other associations in your community? What institutions are in your community? Religious institutions, colleges, universities, hospitals. What are the institutions in your community? And then physical space. What physical space do you have at your congregation? A parking lot, a building, a parsonage, a van. You have physical space or physical assets that can be used to engage your community. Number 5, exchange of resources. Money or other exchange of resources. Resources aren't always financial in terms of money, but it can be in-kind donations as well. And so in-kind donations or money is a way to identify that as an asset. And when it's exchanged for the greater good of the community, you can mobilize the community. And then number 6, culture, stories, and history. What's the history of your community? What are the stories of your community? What's the history of your church? What are the stories of your church? What's the culture? We talked a lot about the culture of generosity earlier, but what's the culture of your community? Are you in an art district? Are you in a recreational district? Are you in a historic district? What is the culture? What are the stories and history of your community? And if you identify these assets and bring them together, you can truly engage your community. Here is a list of the assets in your community. The outer edge, you see local institutions, businesses and industry, libraries, hospitals, local and state parks, schools, colleges, and universities. So as you look at this list, just quickly identify what are the local institutions in your community? What businesses are there? What schools are there? What universities? What parks are there? What hospitals, libraries, businesses, industries? What is present in your community? And they put places of worship under citizens association with this graphic. I prefer to put it out with the institutions, but it will be in our second tier in a moment as we get to there. But just think about the businesses, schools, parks, hospitals, libraries, industry in your community. And in the next tier, we have citizens association, places of worship, us, block groups, cultural groups, neighborhood associations, What are some of those civic or citizens associations that are in your community? Try to identify them. And then finally, as we move to the center, we have gifts of individuals. We have youth, we have income, we have elderly, we have artists, we have talent and skills. What gifts of individuals are in your congregation? What gifts of individuals are in your community? At one church I served, I met with one of the groups. I won't name the group, but it was a group of elderly women. They had a name, and they would meet and they would do floral arrangements, and they did arrangements for funerals and other things in the church. And they felt like they were kind of overlooked and they were kind of cast to the side because of their age. I met with this particular group and I said, you have gifts to give. Would you imagine working with our teenagers and showing them, teaching them how to do floral arrangements? Passing on the skills that you have to another generation, teach them how to do floral arrangements, teach them how to do knit and crochet and so forth. And when I asked questions about that, their eyes lit up. You could see the passion in them, David. They got excited about somebody engaging them with the gifts that they had and the ability to share those gifts. We paired 12 women together with 12, in this case, it happened to be young women, and they passed their skills on to the young women, and they did all the arrangements at the church for all the events. They did it for other churches. And so this became an entrepreneurial project as well, where they generated income, it created jobs. And it all just started from gifts of the women's circle, asking them how could they use their gifts for the greater good in the community? How could we do what they were already doing, pass it on to other generations to create income, to create a better community just by the skills that they have? So again, what gifts of individuals do you have in your community or congregation? What are the civic or citizen associations in your community? What are the local institutions in your community? And so as you kind of think about those three categories and you think about your community, we're going to come back to this throughout our time today. And so here is a community assets map based on what we just saw from the other form. And so you can see here we have local institutions. Again, we have citizen associations. We have gifts of individuals in a heart graphic. And so you have churches, you have businesses, you have income, you have parks, hospitals, older adults, you have artists, you have labeled people, you have community colleges, you have universities, you have houses, schools, you have all of these institutions, and you have all of these associations, and you have gifts of individuals. So again, when you think about asset mapping, I want you to think about mapping out the community assets that are present around your church. Again, this just looks a little different, but what institutions are there? What associations are there? What gifts of individuals are there? And begin to map out who they are. And as you're doing that, you also want to think about a personal capacity inventory. Gifts I can give to my community. The first gift, or one of the gifts we can give to our community, is gift of the head. Things I know something about and would enjoy talking about with others. For example, art, history, movies, birds, whatever it may be. So help people identify in your congregation and in the community, what gifts of head can I give? The second type of gift you want to have people to inventory is gifts of hands. Things or skills I know how to do and would like sharing with others. floral arrangement, knitting, crocheting, sewing, carpentry, sports, gardening, cooking. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Alabama on a farm in a rural town. In fact, Frank wasn't too far from the place where I grew up in a recent trip he just had. And so in that town, growing up on a 15-acre farm, I learned how to garden, I learned how to farm, and that's a skill that I have. And at our church, we work with the scout group, and we work with a grant that we received to construct 4 raised bed vegetable gardens on site at our property, so that we can grow fresh produce and give it to congregants and give it to the community and teach them how to prepare them in a healthy way. And so again, what gifts of hands do you have? And we taught people in the community how to build a small garden in their apartment or at their apartment and at their homes. So this became one of the ways that we mobilized the community just around gardening. And again, they say many of us picked up skills during COVID, and it gave me an opportunity to do a lot of gardening and canning and preserving and all of those other things I learned how to do growing up, and it brought me back full circle to do that. But help people identify the gifts of hand. And then finally, gifts of the heart, things I care about deeply. Jack mentioned earlier, what are you passionate about? What do you care about deeply? Protection of the environment, civic life, children. Identify what people care about, the gifts of the heart. What are they passionate about? And mobilize them in that particular area. My background is environmental engineering, and I'm passionate about God's creation and caring for God's creation. We started a green team at our church, and we mobilized to go and clean up the Anacostia River. We collected 500 pounds of plastic bottles in the Anacostia River, and we're trying to make it swimmable and fishable again. And so there was an article in the paper, and they heard about what our church was doing in caring for the environment, and they said, we want to be a part of that. And they came over and they joined us, all because I'm passionate. Our green team is passionate about the environment. Someone else in the community saw that article in the paper, and they said, we see what you're doing, and we have some money that wasn't claimed. Would you mind submitting a grant application to receive money to do a rain garden at your church, so you can teach people about best management practices for stormwater runoff? I said, yes, I don't mind submitting the application. You see, when we understand our capacity, when we understand the inventory of the resources that are available, I truly believe that money follows ministry. Sometimes we get discouraged and we don't want to move forward because we don't have the money. But I encourage you to get started in community engagement. And when people see what you're doing, it will be contagious and people will want to join. People read articles about what we were doing. They saw the garden on the property of the church, and people just wanted to be a part of what we were doing to help out with food insecurity. I heard someone mention earlier that's their project, to minimize food insecurity in their community. In our community, we have 3 out of 5 children are classified as food insecure, and we're doing our part to make our community food secure so that no child, no person will go hungry in the land of plenty. This is a perception survey that we did to identify the perception of young adults in our community last year. And you can see the plots, gambling, nightlife, mall, businesses, so forth. But if you look at this quadrant, you see some things are not important. And it shifted around a little bit. And some things are important. And some things have a negative perception, the bottom left, and then the bottom right, positive perception. And so we want to focus on the upper right quadrant in this particular area because it's important and it has a positive perception. And so what we saw, the cluster of things in this quadrant here, it informed some of the things that we wanted to do to engage our community. So what we did here, you see our niche: scenic beauty, adventure, sports, trails, parks, environmental concerns, beaches, waterfront. And so our mission at our church is to care for God's people and God's creation. And we use that in our message map. And when we communicate to the community, we say that over and over and over. And we tell them how we care for God's people, how we care for God's creation. And it resonated with a lot of the young adults in our community. You can see environmental concerns here was a part of that. Going over to clean up the Anacostia River, teaching them how to be green, teaching them how to reduce, recycle, and reuse, teaching them about ways that we can care for our planets, refuse plastic, and all of those things. And because that was our passion, my passion, and we saw that it was a way for us to connect with the community, this is where our assets and the community assets intersected. And most of our community engagement that we're doing now at Jones Memorial United Methodist Church is something in this area of the intersection, something around scenic beauty, something around sports, something around environmental concerns, something around parks, because we see that that's where our assets and the assets in the community intersect. They're important and they're positive in their perception. Mission Insight, again, has tools similar to this that will help you understand the perception of the people in your community so that you can begin to see where your passion, your assets intersects with the assets of your community. And since we've done this, we've received about $250,000 in grants to do environmental type ministries, because that is my passion as an environmental engineer, as an earth keeper, someone called to care for God's people and care for God's creation. We have mobilized and we have done community engagement where those two intersect. And a lot of the people that we are engaging may not be Christians.
Hi, you still have me
We
on?
come together on the environmental concerns,
Okay, so
and we're doing our part. Just a reminder, please mute everyone.
Like it was a
We come
camera
together around
over there.
environmental
So if I
concerns
was online or
and
offline or
doing
something.
engagement in that particular area.